Walk through London's financial district today, and you'll see one of the banking centers of the modern world. It is a monument to staggering wealth and influence. Yet, beneath its foundations lies a secret history. There is a hidden story that reveals exactly why the British Empire, an entity that once controlled a quarter of the planet, disintegrated so rapidly following the Second World War. The official history we're all taught is a carefully constructed narrative. We're told that in 1940, Great Britain stood alone as a bastion against the tyranny of Nazi Germany. We're told America arrived on the scene as a selfless ally. We hear of the legendary friendship between Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. The story is one of two great nations fighting side by side in the name of liberty. This is the version we get from Hollywood films and history textbooks, but it is a calculated omission of the truth. There is another, much colder account, written not in treaties, but in ledgers. It is the story of how America's entry into the war wasn't to save Britain, but to acquire it. It is the account of the single largest wealth transfer in human history, where the accumulated riches of 300 years of empire were loaded onto ships, sent across the Atlantic, and were never seen again. This is the story of how Britain sold its future for the price of its own survival. To grasp this, you must return to the absolute terror of the summer of 1940. Europe was a catastrophe. France had been conquered in a mere 6 weeks. The British military had just managed to flee Dunkirk, abandoning their entire arsenal of heavy equipment on the French coastline. The Nazi war machine was assembled on the shores of France, staring across the narrow English Channel, preparing for the final invasion. Britain's position was beyond desperate. They required rifles, ammunition, steel, and food. Above all else, they needed aircraft. The one nation on Earth with the industrial might to provide these things was the United States of America. Winston Churchill appealed to President Roosevelt for assistance. He operated under the assumption that the Americans would recognize the existential threat of Hitler and provide unconditional aid. He was profoundly mistaken. The United States was, by law, neutral. A powerful isolationist movement in America wanted no part in another European conflict. The unpaid debts from the First World War were a fresh memory. They were resolved to avoid making the same mistake. The U.S. Congress had enacted legislation known as the Neutrality Acts. The most critical component of these acts was a policy called cash and carry. It was a simple and utterly ruthless mechanism. It stipulated that any nation at war could purchase American supplies. On 2 conditions: they must pay in full, in cash, immediately, and they were responsible for transporting the materials on their own vessels. There would be no lines of credit. There would be no loans. There would be absolutely no charity. If Britain wanted the tools to fight for its existence, it had to provide gold. This policy ignited a financial crisis in place specials, London, that was every bit as lethal as the German Luftwaffe. While Britain was an affluent empire, its wealth was illiquid, locked up in global investments, properties, and the very infrastructure of its empire. It did not possess a limitless supply of physical gold or American dollars, and to purchase from American factories, only American dollars were accepted. No one would take the British pound, as its value was plummeting and Britain's very survival in the next year was an open question. American manufacturers insisted on hard currency. The British government began to bleed money at a catastrophic rate. Each week, tens of millions of dollars poured from the British Treasury to pay for armaments. This level of expenditure was mathematically impossible to maintain. By mid-1940, officials at the Treasury understood they were about to run out of money. The calculation was simple and horrifying at the current burn rate. Britain would be completely insolvent by Christmas. When the dollars were gone, the flow of weapons would cease, and when the weapons stopped, the war would be over. In total secrecy, Winston Churchill's cabinet made a final, desperate choice. They would liquidate the entire wealth of the nation. They resolved to collect every last ounce of gold from the Bank of England's vaults and transport it to North America. The gamble was astronomical. If German U-boats discovered the plan, they could intercept and sink the convoys. If those ships went to the bottom, Britain wouldn't just lose its war-fighting capacity. It would lose its national savings. It would lose everything. The entire endeavor was codenamed Operation Fish. It remains one of the most audacious and little-known logistical operations of the entire war. It was, quite simply, the greatest physical transfer of wealth ever attempted. Absolute secrecy was paramount. The crews of the ships had no idea of the true nature of their cargo. The gold was secured deep within the Bank of England in London, existing as massive bars and chests of coins. The first challenge was moving it from London to the western ports of Scotland and Liverpool. Armored trains were used, operating exclusively under the cover of darkness. The gold was packed into ordinary-looking wooden crates. Some of these containers were stenciled with the word fish, giving the operation its name. But these were no ordinary boxes. They were so dense that the dockside cranes strained visibly to lift them. The treasure was then loaded onto the Royal Navy's fastest warships, including its battleships and accompanying cruisers. Among the key vessels in this operation was the HMS Emerald, which departed from Green, Scotland, in June of 1940. Its cargo was a staggering fortune, over £130 million in gold, bullion, and securities, a sum equivalent to billions of dollars today. The ship's captain had received an uncompromising directive if capture by the Germans seemed imminent. He was to scuttle the vessel in the deepest part of the ocean. The gold was to be sacrificed to the sea rather than surrendered to the hands of Hitler. The transatlantic voyage was a harrowing ordeal. The North Atlantic stands as one of the most ferocious oceans on the planet. These ships contended with colossal storms, facing waves that relentlessly crashed over their decks. They were forced to maintain maximum speed to evade lurking German U-boats. Transmissions were forbidden, as using their radios would instantly compromise their position. They moved like phantoms through the fog, safeguarding the entire fortune of an empire. On one crossing, the weather was so violent that the crates of gold secured in the ship's magazines were torn from their moorings. Heavy gold bars began sliding across the deck, striking steel bulkheads like artillery shells. Sailors had to venture down into the hold during the chaotic storm and attempt to restrain the loose bullion before it could tear a hole through the hull. It was a brutal, physical struggle to save the nation's wealth. When the convoy finally made port in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, the sense of relief was profound. But their mission was far from over. The gold still needed to be offloaded and moved to a secure location. Special trains, flanked by armed guards, were used to shift the treasure from the port of Halifax to the Bank of Canada in Ottawa. The sheer scale of this wealth was breathtaking. The load of gold was so immense that the floor of the Bank of Canada's vault in Ottawa actually began to buckle under the strain. They were forced to structurally reinforce the building. Over the subsequent few years, the Canadian capital secured more gold than any other location on the globe, with the exception of Fort Knox. This treasure, however, was not meant for storage. It was meant to be liquidated. It was instantly deposited into the British account to settle payments with the Americans. But even this vast fortune was not enough. The war was draining millions of dollars every single hour. The British government also coerced its populace into surrendering their foreign investments. If you were a British national holding shares in an American corporation or possessed property in New York, you were compelled by law to sell it and transfer the U.S. dollars to the government. The government compensated citizens with British pounds, but it seized the hard currency to finance the war effort. This process was termed the vesting of securities. It represented a colossal confiscation of private wealth for the sake of the national interest. The British government proceeded to sell these seized assets on the New York Stock Exchange. However, because Britain's desperation was common knowledge, American investors exploited the situation. They knew Britain was a forced seller and consequently offered absurdly low prices. It was a national fire sale. One of the most glaring examples of this was the forced sale of the American Viscose Corporation. This was a huge company owned by the British conglomerate Courtaulds, valued at over $100 million. The American government, under the leadership of Franklin Roosevelt, exerted pressure on the British to sell it, to prove their financial ruin before any aid would be forthcoming. The British were cornered into selling the company for only $54 million, barely half its actual worth. British Treasury officials were livid. They felt they were being fleeced by their own allies, but they were left with no alternative. They sold the corporation, and the money was spent in a few short weeks on more aircraft and more artillery. This exact pattern repeated itself throughout 1940. Britain was systematically liquidating every asset it had gathered. Over the past 100 years, they sold off their railways in Argentina. They offloaded their mines in Africa. They divested their holdings in American steel companies. They were dismantling the empire just to keep the country afloat. By December of 1940, the situation had become dire once more. The gold was gone. The private investments had been liquidated. All the cash was exhausted. Lord Lothian, Britain's ambassador to the United States, arrived in New York and addressed the reporters. He was a man worn down by circumstance. He looked into the cameras and stated bluntly, "Britain is broke. We have no more dollars for the most powerful empire in the world." This was a staggering public admission. It served as a clear sign to Roosevelt that the rules had to change. The cash and carry policy could not continue for the simple reason that there was no more cash. Britain needed a lifeline. They needed military hardware but had no means to pay. This is the very moment that precipitated the famous Lend-Lease Act. But before delving into Lend-Lease, it's crucial to understand the price that America demanded for its assistance. It was not just about money. They were after power. They were after territory. They were after the very keys to the future. The United States government understood perfectly that Britain was on the brink. They perceived a golden opportunity to remake the geopolitical order. Britain possessed a global network of naval bases that enabled the Royal Navy to dominate the world's oceans. The United States wanted access to these pivotal locations, and so they came forward with a proposal. It was known as the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. The U.S. would agree to send. Britain received 50 World War I-era destroyers. These were obsolete, rusting hulks, far from the modern warships the country desperately needed. But they were a step up from nothing. The price for these 50 decaying vessels was staggering. The United States demanded 99-year leases on naval installations in the Caribbean, Newfoundland, and other vital island territories. It was a predatory, grotesquely unbalanced transaction. Britain was forced to sign away its sovereign lands for a century, in return for a handful of boats that were barely fit for the sea. Winston Churchill despised the arrangement, viewing it as a profound humiliation, the first nail in the coffin of the British Empire. Yet he had no choice but to sign. It was a perfect contradiction. He famously declared he did not become Prime Minister to oversee the empire's dissolution. But in that moment, he was doing precisely that. He was mortgaging the empire's physical assets for its short-term survival. This was the brutal reality of 1940. It was not an era of partnership, but of cold, calculated leverage. The British envoys in Washington were reportedly driven to tears, convinced the Americans were exploiting their desperation. They saw a deliberate strategy to bleed Britain of its wealth, a design to ensure that after the war, Britain could never again challenge American economic supremacy. They were, in almost every respect, correct. The massive transfer of gold and securities in 1940 permanently shifted the globe's financial axis from London to New York. Before the war, the pound sterling was the world's undisputed reserve currency, the bedrock of global trade. By the time Britain's bullion had been moved across the Atlantic, the US dollar had seized the throne. The vaults in Ottawa and New York overflowed while London stood empty. The physical gold, the anchor of the financial system, had been deliberately relocated. Yet the Americans were not satisfied with just gold and territory. They demanded technology. Britain may have been losing the financial war, but scientifically, it remained the world leader. In secret labs, British scientists had engineered incredible tools to combat the Germans. They had pioneered radar, the technology that allowed them to detect enemy aircraft at night. They had conceived the foundational principles of the jet engine. Their work in nuclear physics was groundbreaking, laying the path that would ultimately lead to the atomic bomb. In these fields, the Americans lagged far behind. And so, in the autumn of 1940, another clandestine operation was set in motion, led by Sir Henry Tizard. On the Tizard mission, he journeyed to Washington with a simple black metal box. Contained within were the crown jewels of British technological supremacy. It held blueprints, prototypes, and the core secrets Britain had taken years to uncover. Tizard's orders were absolute. Give everything to the Americans. No strings attached. No payments requested. Simply hand over the entire portfolio. The desperate hope was that this offering of secrets would galvanize the Americans into accelerating arms production for Britain's defense. When Tizard unveiled the box's contents in a Washington boardroom, the American scientific establishment was floored. They examined a device known as the cavity magnetron, a small copper block that resembled some strange kind of musical instrument. It was the core component of an advanced radar system, one that was 1,000 times more potent than any American equivalent. A US historian would later call that single piece of hardware the most significant cargo ever to reach American soil, allowing the nation to bypass years of research and development. Britain also surrendered the plans for the Whittle jet engine. They gave up their atomic bomb research, the very work the Americans would adopt and expand into, the Manhattan Project. In a single stroke, Britain relinquished its technological superiority. It gave away the industries of tomorrow. They did this because they were bankrupt and utterly alone. They were purchasing goodwill with the currency of their intellectual property. By the close of 1940, Britain had narrowly survived the threat of invasion. The Battle of Britain was a victory, but the nation was a hollowed-out ruin. Its treasury was bare. its foreign investments liquidated. Its gold was in American hands, and its military bases were leased away for a century. Its most guarded scientific secrets had been surrendered. Britain was now utterly dependent on the United States. It had pawned its entire future to buy a few more months of survival. And the price for that survival was about to escalate. The Americans were drafting a new program called Lend-Lease, which Roosevelt deceptively framed as merely lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. The analogy suggested a generous, temporary loan of equipment to be returned. The reality was a suffocating system of debt and economic servitude designed to chain Britain to the US for the next half-century. The economic war had only just begun, and the ultimate price of victory would be far higher than anyone in London could possibly fathom. The dawn of 1941 initiated the next phase in the systematic financial dismantling of the British Empire. The gold was gone, the cash was gone, and private assets had been seized and sold off. By this point, Britain survived solely on an American-controlled lifeline. Then, in March of 1941, the United States Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act. This piece of legislation is one of the most famous pieces of legislation in history, yet its public image was built on an act of supreme deception. The narrative of generosity was masterfully crafted by President Franklin Roosevelt through a simple, powerful metaphor. He claimed, "If my neighbor's house is on fire, I don't sell him my garden hose. I lend him the hose. And, once the fire is extinguished, he returns it." This was a masterstroke of public relations, painting a picture of the US as a helpful neighbor, merely loaning out tanks and aircraft to be given back after the conflict. The truth of the contract, however, was engineered to be far more predatory. This was no garden hose loan. The Lend-Lease agreement was a carefully laid trap. It was riddled with conditions, specifically designed to systematically dismantle Britain's economic power for good. The American team at the negotiating table had their eyes on a prize far greater than defeating Hitler. They were architecting the post-war global order. Their goal was to guarantee that once the war was over, America would rise from the ashes as the sole, unchallenged economic superpower. A crucial condition of Lend-Lease was forcing Britain to liquidate its system of imperial preference, the very trade framework that allowed preferential, low-tariff commerce with its dominions like India, Australia, and Canada. This system was the financial sinew holding the British Empire together, and for that reason, the Americans despised it. They saw it as a barrier to their own corporate access to these vast markets. The British Empire was a private club, and they wanted the doors kicked open for American business. This objective was codified directly into the agreement, forcing a British commitment to tear down these economic walls after the war. Britain was, in essence, bartering away the entire economic foundation of its empire just to get the tools to save it. They were saving their home on the condition that they demolish its internal structure. On top of this, the aid was anything but free. While the military hardware was technically a loan, all the logistics, raw materials, and civilian goods were meticulously recorded as a colossal debt. The United States maintained an exhaustive account of every single item sent over the Atlantic. Every can of processed meat, every barrel of fuel, every single rubber tire was added to the bill. British envoys in Washington pleaded for their own immense contributions to be considered as repayment. They pointed out that their soldiers were dying against a common foe while their capital city was being relentlessly bombed. They called for an equality of sacrifice, believing that British lives should be valued as much as American money. But the US Treasury rejected this moral argument entirely. A debt was a debt, and the books had to be balanced. As the war raged, Britain's entire economy was warped beyond recognition. Production of cars, refrigerators, and clothing for export ceased. The whole nation was converted into a single, massive weapons factory, completely dependent on America for all other necessities. This strategic dependency meant that Britain forfeited its global export markets, a global exporting giant before the war. By 1944, Britain's exports had plunged by 70%. American corporations seamlessly swept in to capture this abandoned market share. As British factories built fighter planes, American factories produced consumer goods, cementing their economic control over South America and Asia. The United States was systematically consuming Britain's economic future. While Britain was fighting for its very survival, the British leadership understood exactly what was happening. But they were utterly powerless to resist. They were caught inside the gilded cage of Lend-Lease. Then, the war ended. In August 1945, Japan's surrender marked the end of the Second World War. While London erupted in celebration and people danced in Trafalgar Square, the response from Washington was brutally swift and transactional. The Truman administration, in power since Roosevelt's death, cancelled Lend-Lease without warning. On August 21st, 1945, mere days after victory was declared, President Truman's signature halted all shipments. The shock was catastrophic for the British. Supply ships already en route across the Atlantic were ordered to reverse course. For the British economy, which had become utterly hooked on American support, it was an immediate and total system failure. The nation was destitute, with no export industry, no dollar reserves, and suddenly, no more American supplies. In desperation, the British government dispatched the world-renowned economist John Maynard Keynes to Washington to plead for a new loan. As a celebrated intellectual of immense stature, Keynes went to America expecting to be met with gratitude. He anticipated a generous gift, or at the very least, a loan with no interest, to help an exhausted ally get back on its feet. He delivered an impassioned speech, reminding them how Britain stood alone in 1940 and had sacrificed its entire economy for the shared victory. He thought this appeal to shared history would resonate. The Americans were not impressed. He was facing cold-blooded bankers and politicians concerned only with their own balance sheets and voters. They informed Keynes there would be no gift. A loan would be offered, but it would carry interest, and it would be attached to yet more crippling conditions. The Anglo-American loan of 1946 was a final, bitter humiliation. The United States extended $3.75 billion, a vast sum, but far less than Keynes had requested, and its terms were punitive, harsh. America's primary condition was that the British pound be made fully convertible, a move that meant anyone, anywhere, could swap their pounds for United States dollars. It was a calculated strike at the heart of Britain's control over its own finances. Keynes saw the trap, warning that it would trigger a catastrophic run on the pound. Yet he was cornered, with the alternative being national starvation. He signed the agreement. Upon his return to London, the man was a shadow of himself, broken by the ordeal. The stress of the negotiations contributed heavily to his death shortly thereafter. He had gambled everything to preserve Britain's financial sovereignty and knew, with certainty, that he had lost. When the convertibility rule was enacted in 1947, Keynes's direst predictions became reality. A global stampede began as countries and financiers raced to liquidate their British pounds for the security of American dollars. Within weeks, Britain's financial reserves were utterly depleted. It was a complete financial meltdown. London was forced to halt convertibility and return to America, cap in hand, for another bailout. The nation was plunged into a prolonged period of crushing austerity. As America cruised into its 1950s post-war boom, defined by massive cars and sprawling suburbs, Great Britain was still handing out ration books for bread and meat. Rationing persisted in Britain until 1954. A full 9 years after victory was declared. The children of the victors were raised on powdered eggs and patched up clothing, while the children of defeated West Germany were experiencing a faster recovery thanks to more astutely managed American aid. For decades, the war debt was a suffocating presence over Britain. The billions of dollars borrowed in 1945 and 1946 were not forgivable. Every single year, the British government cut a check directly to the United States Treasury. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, as the British economy buckled under strikes and runaway inflation, that annual payment served as a grim testament to the true cost of victory. There were moments when Britain had to request deferrals on the payments, admitting they simply did not have the funds. The so-called special relationship always felt profoundly different when the invoice arrived. But this was about more than just money. It was about a fundamental shift in global power, the handover of gold, military bases, and crucial technology. In the early 1940s was the very moment the global scepter was passed. The British Empire didn't simply disintegrate due to independence movements in places like India or Africa. It collapsed because its bank account was drained to zero. You cannot sustain a global empire on an empty treasury. Britain was no longer able to finance its garrisons east of the Suez. It could no longer afford to project power onto the world stage. America immediately filled that power vacuum. The United States Navy took the Royal Navy's place as the enforcer of global order. The U.S. dollar supplanted the pound sterling as the world's reserve currency. The American century was born from the red ink in the Lend-Lease ledgers, precisely where the British century died. The final act in this drama unfolded much more recently than you probably realize. For 60 years following the war, Britain dutifully made its payments. The checks kept coming through the Cold War, past the fall of the Berlin Wall, and into the age of the Internet. Then, on December 29th, 2006, a final wire transfer was sent from the British government to the U.S. Federal Reserve. The amount was approximately $83 million. This was the last installment. The Economic Secretary to the Treasury released a brief statement acknowledging America's wartime support. It was a sterile, quiet conclusion to an epic saga. It took Britain 61 years to finally settle the bill for defeating Hitler. When we analyze the Second World War, the heroism of the secondary soldiers, pilots, and civilians is undeniable and must be honored. But that is not the whole story. We must also follow the gold. We must visualize the convoys battling through storms, their holds filled with the plundered wealth of an empire. We must remember the clandestine backroom deals in Washington, where entire islands were bartered for aging destroyers. This grand transfer of wealth was not a crime in any legal sense. It was a business transaction. It was the price tag on national survival. Britain bought its continued existence, but in doing so, it sold its global supremacy. The United States did not steal the British Empire. They acquired it through leverage. They bought it, asset by asset, crate of gold by crate of gold, patent by patent. So the next time you hear a politician speak of the unbreakable bond between the United States and the United Kingdom, Remember that the relationships between nations are never about friendship. They are about power and interest. In 1940, Britain's interest was avoiding a German invasion. America's interest was becoming the new global hegemon. In the end, both parties achieved their goals. But the receipt for that monumental transaction stands as one of the costliest documents in all of 22 human history. The gold was never returned. The technology fueled America's technological revolution. The bases became permanent American military installations, and Britain reverted to being an island nation rich in history, but stripped of the raw, global power it once commanded. The war was won, but paying the invoice took a lifetime. Subscribe to understand the world as it is, not as we're told it is. Because when the next chapter of history is written, you will want to be one of the few who understood the blueprint. If you believe this analysis is flawed, prove it in the comments. If you are convinced it is correct, explain precisely why. Either way, history belongs to those who dare to debate it. I will be reading your arguments. Thank you for your time.